Hello, everybody. I've got a lot of slides. I actually added some more this morning because I had been holding off and just decided I should just overload you with information. And my excuses if there's too much, but there's so much I would like to cover. I just thought I'd throw it in there. So I'm going to get going now. Um, Hi, I'm Noah Falstein. This is Games is Digital Therapeutics. I hope you're in the right place. Um, just to give you a sort of background on how I got into all this, I've been in the games industry for almost 44 years at this point, and was making games in university before that. My mother, pictured here about the time I was born, I think. She was a little concerned about me getting into video games. This is a brand new thing, in the 1970s, 1980s, and wasn't sure about this. Was worried that they were a fad. And I told her I could always keep on doing some of the business programming that I had learned to do, as a kind of training in my college. And she said, "Well, I guess computers aren't a fad." But I could tell that she was hoping that I would have actually chosen some other sort of intellectual profession, maybe be a doctor, and was sorry to disappoint her. But I ended up having a really great career in games. I've worked on the top row there you see a lot of entertainment products from the arcade industry when I was just starting out, through LucasArts, where I was one of the first employees, and as a freelancer afterwards. I spent 4 years as chief game designer at Google, working a lot on their VR and AR projects. But the bottom row is work that I've done as a freelancer that's all been in the games and health overlap, starting that East 3 thing you see on the end here is one of the first consumer quality brainwave monitors that was tried out and never actually made it to market. So as many projects have failed. But I'll be talking about a lot of the ones that did in this talk and give you a sense of what's going on. So first, before I start, it's interesting, I've given this talk in a number of different venues and with very different ratios of things, but I just want to ask a few questions, and please don't be shy. Nobody's recording your answers here, but I wonder how many people have worked on serious games or gamification or whatever terrible word you want to use to describe it. Okay, about, I would say, 20 or 30%. Anybody here with a degree or a professional training in the medicine or health field? Oh, great. I give this talk sometimes at medical conferences when nobody has worked on games and everybody raises their hand at that question. And has anyone actually shipped a game that was health related, or possibly a crossover? Good. We've even got a few of those. Well, most of you, this is calibrated well then, because most of you will find this interesting. I know a lot of people haven't heard about many of these. First, I'm going to start by talking about why we should even care about this as game developers. I mean, is this an interesting little side topic, or why should it affect you? Talking about general ways, sort of categorizing ways that games are used for healthcare. There really aren't good lists of breaking down how these sorts of games work, or how to categorize them, basically. And I'll go over some of the ones that are emerging over time, and what it is that we from the games industry bring to this field, why they should actually care about us. I'll be talking about 3 different levels of treatment that are all sort of overlapping and a little bit fuzzy around the edges, but are a very useful way to kind of judge the level of both testing that's been done and efficacy often that these treatments have when they're in treatment. And I'm giving lots of examples just to give you a sense of the range of what's out there, since everybody is going to have different interests in what might be possible. And this should be of interest to anybody in the games industry. Really, they need the healthcare industry and healthcare and games together use everything we do in games, plus everything that the medical side of things does as well. So first of all, why I think it's worthwhile to explore this as a game developer. As a designer myself, one of the things I really like about it, having worked in the industry so long, the only way anybody ever survives a long time in this industry is by reinventing themselves and being really avidly interested in new things. And obviously, in health, there's just a huge range of new things to learn. Many of the doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, researchers that I've worked with are very eager to help. In fact, just to throw in, if you're looking at a project like this and the people don't really like games and don't really think much of games but are reluctantly trying to add games in, I try and stay away from it. It's the cases where the medical people are really excited about working with game developers who are also really excited about working in the medical field where everybody's very happy. But it's a real challenge because everything I've learned as a game designer for entertainment titles, I need to put into play here, plus adapt it to everything that is necessary for each new case. I've worked on dozens of these games by now, and every one of them has a different approach necessary, some fresh things to learn and things to do. And they have a great future. One of the ways that I look at this is that I think that over time, games have the potential of taking over somewhere between 3 to 5% of healthcare needs, particularly for mental rehabilitation or help, but also recovery from injuries, for training doctors and physicians. I mean, that alone could actually account for a larger percentage of that, depending on how it goes. Range of stuff you'll be seeing. And if games take even, say, 3% of the world spend on healthcare every year, that would be not bigger than the entire games industry now, but bigger than all of the consoles that are out there now. Not quite as big as mobile games, but as again, there's a lot of potential for growth there. It's also really satisfying, this is the last but not least category, in that, we're entertaining people and improving their health. We're helping them in really tangible ways. Entertainment is very helpful. I don't want to denigrate that at all, but it's wonderful to think that we can actually be helping people with serious medical issues and even saving lives. So a lot of the time people come to us in the games industry, and more people are turning to that. I'm actually busier doing this now than I've ever been. Often they're looking just kind of at the surface of engagement and retention, essentially how to get people interested in their training or treatment or whatever the medical aims are, and how to keep them with it for a long time, which particularly on the researcher side, many of the projects I've been involved with have been with a neuroscience researcher who has this thing that they want to do to get some research information. It's like put a crosshair on a target and then move it to another target and then another one, and repeat that for, about 10 minutes and do it 20 times over the course of a few weeks. And about 30 seconds into that, everybody's bored because they're used to games that we make, and that's really terrible. So you need to actually make the stuff a lot more fun. And then to keep them going for a long time, and I'll talk about some examples of how we're doing that. Excuse me, sorry about this. One of the sort of categories on the sort of lighter side of this, meaning not as much proof being necessary, is giving information to patients like this. Where's my laser here? This first one here is a lot of children are very scared about going into the hospital. Having games that can actually show them what it's like, or actually in the hospital reassure them about what's going on, or help them after an operation to understand what they need to do to keep their bandages safe, that sort of thing. I worked on a game called Hungry Red Planet that was a nutrition game, just an informational, educational sort of game, but about healthcare. One of the things that I learned there is that it's much easier to teach people about things than it is to get them to change their behavior based on what they've learned. You can learn, for example, that an apple is healthier than a slice of pizza, but when you're given a choice of which one do you want for a snack, most kids will go for the pizza. And finally, we've got, as an alternative to opioids, and I don't often do videos, but let's see whether this will work here. And it's not working. I was afraid that wasn't going to translate over. Hold on a sec. Let me just see. No. All right. Sorry about that. Give me a sec. Yeah, sorry, this morning I tried a few things and wasn't able to test them out thoroughly, but let me just describe instead and make sure that I'm back where I was supposed to be. Yeah, okay, I see what I would need to do. Let's not worry about that now. Any rate, Dr. Sam Rodriguez at Stanford Children's Hospital, Lucille Packard Children's Hospital, I think it's called, is a doctor who's been experimenting with VR. And here you're seeing a VR headset. This particular kid is a 10-year-old who was in a really terrible accident in a go-kart and stripped a lot of the skin off of his arm here and needed bandages that had to be changed daily, and it was extremely painful. They started giving him sedatives so that he could deal with the pain. It quickly got up to the maximum amount allowable for a kid his age, and he was still frantic every time that they had to do it. And luckily, Dr. Rodriguez had this VR game, essentially, that he had helped develop that was basically a sort of snowboarding game. And this guy was also a skateboarder and loved it. And one of the wonderful things about it is that it was purely head tilt controlled. So you're going down the mountain by, tilting your head like this. And it meant that he could have his arm worked on while he was in this VR treatment. And the very first time he tried it, he went from needing the maximum amount of opioids and still it was too much pain to actually going through the procedure with no drugs at all and just somebody talking to him about, what are you seeing now? Did you dodge that last ice flow? And this was clearly an edge case, and that he was one of the sort of best cases there. But it just shows the power that games can have, and found it particularly inspiring. You can find videos online by searching for Rodriguez Pain VR, and he's done a number of other things. So just one of the more interesting cases I've seen. A company I've worked with a number of times is Level X. I'm ex-LucasArts. The head of Level X is also from LucasArts. There's an interesting trend there. I have no idea why. There are a bunch of us be getting into more of that later on. But Level X is a company that raised several tens of millions of dollars, then was bought out by BrainLab, a German pharma company, and is just thriving now. They keep expanding all the time. They train doctors, and doctors of all types. The one you see here is a intubation, where you're trying to put a tube down somebody's throat, or, in this case, it was removing a nail in somebody's esophagus. The interesting thing is people complain about our games being too violent and bloody. And the hardest things I've ever had to look at are Level X's games that are just so realistic. In fact, they were demonstrating, he was very proud of how the physics of blood pooling, when you nick the side of the throat, for example. And I just, okay, thank you, I've seen enough. Embodied Labs over here. This is a company run by a woman named Carrie Shaw in the LA area. She uses VR to train caregivers by essentially putting them in the shoes of the people who have the problems that they're treating. This particular one is for macular degeneration. When you get this big black blotch in your center of vision, you can only use your peripheral vision. And you can see there's this big black cloud in the middle of the screen. Somebody has to go through a dinner party where the only way they can see things is by essentially turning and looking out of the corner of their eye. And she's got other ones for a range of different treatments. And I just think it's great as a way of getting people who are caregivers for people who have something that they have never experienced themselves, using VR as a way to give them a sense of that. Now I'll get into the heart of this. The main topic here is games as digital therapeutics, and I'm really interested in what happens when games are used to treat things of different types. On the left there, you can see something from a company called MindMaze, a Swiss company, and this is a company that does rehabilitation from strokes as one of their primary care things. And this is a game where, with the camera there, it's not a Microsoft Kinect, but a similar kind of process where you've lost some control over a side of your body, and you use motions of your arm to control a dolphin and that is going around and feeding. And It can be very painful for people and certainly very boring to do these repetitive exercises. But when you're actually controlling a game, it gets a lot more retentive and enjoyable. On the right there, you see a very simple, primitive VR headset that's used for a company called Dopavision that I've been working with a lot recently that I'll get to at the end. Dope meaning dopamine, and a very exciting treatment that I'm saving for the last here. First of all, before I get to that, what are the contributions that we from the games industry do? We talked about engagement and retention, but this is sort of a different angle. That one thing is that, of course, we make games and we use game mechanics as well. I'm not fond of the term gamification. There's a wonderful article written years ago by a friend of mine, Ian Bogost, called "Gamification is Bullshit." And I would suggest you Google that if you're curious. It's a really wonderful intellectual, erudite discussion on why that name is actually hurting its spread or the use of it in a useful way. But there's no doubt that even individual game mechanics can be helpful. I actually would also point at Duolingo as one of the few apps that uses what is normally called gamification in a really effective way. Not perfect, but much better than many others do. We also bring to the whole industry all the tools, the engines we have. A lot of the stuff we see is done in major game engines like Unreal and other ones that people are really angry about. Tools to make graphics, a lot of stuff that we do as game developers. In fact, the example I was giving about making the blood pool realistically, that's actually done in a lot of gore and horror games, but here it can actually be applied to teach doctors and people who are learning how to make real physics work, which is, many people in the games industry are applying that. And of course, animation. And finally, just broadly, different types of technology that are often perfected within the games industry, where it's okay to be off by a little bit in a game and not off a little bit when you're using a medical treatment, for example. So we're a way of helping bridge the gap between something new like VR and AR, eye tracking or body or head tracking. There are a lot of really fun titles using those things. And just innovation in general, that we're always on the cutting edge of technology. And compared to many other people in tech, game developers are really used to and very good at implementing new technologies and figuring out what they're good for. So the core thing about these sorts of things are three rough levels of treatment: digital wellness, digital medicine, and digital therapeutics. And without getting into too much detail, what happens as you go through that list, and these are fairly arbitrary titles, but they're gradually getting a little bit more traction, particularly wellness on one end and therapeutics on the other. The idea is that wellness is something that you haven't done. You may have done some testing, but not enough big randomized controlled trials to be sure that everything is working and that it's totally safe and effective. But you may have testimonials from people who've tried your app and this is working fine. You can't make claims, and this varies obviously from country to country what you can say. But in general, if you don't have the test results or a regulatory board approval like the FDA in the US or CE mark here in Europe, then you can't make claims about it being effective or not. Digital medicine, you've done some tests, you have some small trials, but they haven't passed the rigor of these boards yet. And finally, full-fledged digital therapeutics have gotten some okay by the FDA or CE mark or other equivalent regulatory boards. So starting with the first case, just a few things. A lot of stuff in this area are general health, exercise, meditation, and many of you may have seen Supernatural that got bought up by, well, it was still Facebook at the time. That was an exercise game that was inspired by Beat Saber, but done in a trained exercise regimen. And it came out very serendipitously for them right at the beginning of the pandemic when people couldn't go to their gyms. But if anybody's ever done exercise games in VR, you learn sweating into a VR headset is not a pleasant experience. So there needs to be a little more work on that. Some examples for digital medicine, and I'm going to slow down a little bit here because I realize my timing is working out well. Digital medicine, these are a couple of companies that I've worked with directly. Helium, spelled a little oddly as you see here, does both augmented and virtual reality for things to help people relax, to recover from post-traumatic stress. The AR product they have that I like the most, you look at a floor or a desk or any flat surface in front of you through your phone, and you wear a headband that they work in conjunction with. It's just a very simple EEG headband that's on the market. And the name of it is escaping me at the moment. It's not Muse. They tried that and they switched to a different one. But it measures your brain waves. And for the science-minded in the audience, it turns out that your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain, right behind your forehead, on gamma brain waves, if there's a high differential between one side, one hemisphere and the other of that particular area, it's associated with being calm and relaxed. So they're actually doing some neurofeedback to help you do that. And as you get better and better at relaxing, a little plant grows in front of you on the desk or the floor or wherever, and then pods start to form on the plant, and they open up, and they're actually butterflies coming out of chrysalises. And the room around you gradually fills with butterflies the better you are at relaxing. And I think it's a lovely metaphor, because I find it actually more and more pleasant and easier to relax the more butterflies that are out there. And of course, the more relaxed I am, the more there are. So it's a really nice application. Again, not really a game, but you can see using a lot of what we do in the games industry. And they do quite a bit in VR as well. It's a very interesting company. It's a women-owned and run company in Columbia, Missouri, right in the heart of the US, where not a whole lot of apps are developed. Train Pain, by contrast, is an Israeli product. This is still in development. It's a way to treat chronic pain by retraining your brain to interpret the pain signals as just a sensation that you can acknowledge or ignore if you need to. And they do that with these little leads that you stick on your body. You put one on the part of your body that's painful and one on another part of your body that is not. And this is for chronic pain of things that people have had for years in many cases. And then you play a game that needs input from either one or the other of these things, which buzz in little sort of Morse code simple sequences like dot, dot, dash, whatever. So you're playing this simple game. Think of things like Match 3 game or Bubble Popper game, which is the current thing they're playing with. And as you do that, it says pay attention to the left side, and you get dash, dot, dash, and you use that to do the next shot in the bubble shooter. And as you progress through this and you get better at paying attention to one side or the other, it then starts to send signals to both sides at once. So it tells you pay attention to the left side, and you have to ignore the signal on the right side. And what happens is that you gradually train yourself to ignore the sensation from one area and focus on the sensation from another. And doesn't work with everyone, but in the testing they've done so far, and they're scaling up their testing, it's had remarkable results. And it was something I'm particularly excited about here is that they started with fibromyalgia, which is a pain that is very acute, primarily among women over 60 years old, who are often not thought of as a big games demographic, but these types of casual games are actually the most popular in that demographic, and quite a few women are playing it. And a lot of women who have had pain for years, sometimes after only a few sessions with this, are finding it to be extremely effective, partly because it's not trying to eliminate the pain, but simply help you understand how to change the way that your body interprets it. One quick aside there, I learned about the power that games have to deal with your brain and pain when I had this strange pain in this part of my leg years ago. And I couldn't figure out what was causing it until I realized that I'd been playing Civilization II a lot. And I would hook my foot around the chair, and start playing the game. And it would start saying, hey, this is starting to hurt. You should move your foot. And my brain would say, hey, Genghis Khan is attacking us. Give me, some time here. This is really important. And eventually my leg would go numb, and I wouldn't even notice until I tried to stand up after playing for like 4 hours straight and almost fell over because my leg had gone to sleep. So I personally am very much endorsing the ability of your brain to use the game to completely distract you from pain. One of the first digital therapeutics I worked with was a game called Remission. And I was very pleased. I don't know if she's here now, but somebody I talked to earlier had heard of that game, and just first person at a game conference that knew about it that wasn't specifically in health. This is an old game from 20 years ago, and it gives you a sense of why there aren't that many of them. This was funded by a company called Hope Lab that is founded by the wife of the man who started eBay, and their personal net worth of that couple was about $4 billion at the time. That's billion with $1,000 million. And it cost multiple millions of dollars to develop the game, which isn't surprising to us in the games industry, but is extremely rare for games for health. And then another $4 million, I believe, on a huge randomized controlled trial with over, I think, 370 patients in 4 different hospitals. And these were teens who had had leukemia and had had radiation treatment and then were on chemotherapy. And because they were teenagers, they were told, okay, you're through the tough thing now with the radiation, take this pill. And they take it and it makes them nauseous. And the next time, take this pill again. And it's like, oh, sure. And they throw it away because they don't want to get sick and they think they're probably fine. And besides, they're 14 and they feel great. And it's a really dangerous thing. You're playing with their own lives, but doctors, parents wasn't enough to convince them. The game essentially took them, inside the body. These graphics are, sort of PS1 era graphics, but you're flying around blasting cancer cells, and the chemotherapy in the bloodstream is the ammunition and your reloads. And if the patient whose body you're in is not taking their pills, there are no reloads, and you start to see the cancer multiply. And even though you would think you wouldn't need a game to tell people that, particularly when they've been through, radiation treatment, the big studies they did showed that it was extremely effective in increasing their adherence to taking the medicine. So that was the one that made me realize, wow, we can really start saving lives of people with this type of game. The company that I've worked with the most along these lines is called Akili Interactive. And I'm just curious, how many people have heard of Akili Interactive or Endeavor RX? Anybody? So it's interesting, just one hand here. And how many of you were at the ADHD talk an hour and a half ago? Yeah, I thought there'd be a lot of common interest. I'm the one who stood up in front and said something about this because there is a game to treat ADHD. And in fact, it's not only cleared by the FDA and the CE mark, it is the only game cleared by the FDA and CE mark, which means at first, you actually had to get a doctor to prescribe the game. You couldn't buy this game online. And the thought was that would increase people's confidence in it all. But it also made it really hard for them to kind of break into the market and get it started. So they're still providing that, but they have also just in a few months ago, and I should say full disclosure, I own some stock in the company, but frankly, it would have to go up a lot before it was worth anything at this point. But this is a really interesting thing because their process has been shown through testing to be equally effective to drugs like Adderall or Ritalin that has some pretty serious side effects. And to get the approval and go through this process, they have to analyze and what are the most dangerous or prevalent side effects. The 2 most prevalent for playing the game turned out to have been occasional headaches and frustration, which compared to the side effects from taking heavy-duty drugs was pretty minimal. This has been in the works for almost 15 years at this point. I was involved in some of the earliest cases, and what you're seeing here is its predecessor, essentially called NeuroRacer. This was done on a $10,000 budget, very simple game just to do the research. having people hooked up to these medical quality EEG headsets. Dr. Adam Ghazali, who was behind this research, was head of brain imaging at UCSF in San Francisco. And he was able to do a a moderate-sized study of how this was helping people with their attention. And it was so well done that in the peer-reviewed journal Nature, it actually has, this is the video game on the cover, the first and only time a video game has made it to Nature like that. And then they came up with using the similar structure. Instead of driving a little car, this is aimed at pediatric ADHD originally, but in fact it's effective for anyone with ADHD. You're driving this along. There are these little creatures flying from the distance over you, and it gradually gets more and more complex. You start with just 3 different colors of creatures, and it says capture by tapping the screen red ones and letting the blue and yellow ones go by. And you start at a low speed and you're moving along, and it's quite easy. But this game has one of the most challenging levels of dynamic difficulty adjustment I've ever seen in a game, because for somebody with ADHD, you need to have a very high level of intensity to get them really engaged and not lose attention and wander. But as many of you heard in the previous talk, people with ADHD, once they do get engaged, they can be very hyper-focused. And they found that this is very effective because it turns out that the mechanism in the brain for paying attention to something is a separate mechanism than the one for not being distracted by something. And I've always thought of those as, well, it's all one thing. If you're attentive to one thing, you're not distracted by the others. But in fact, they're completely different mechanisms in the brain. And this game requires you to use both of those simultaneously. And so what happens is you get better and better at selectively ignoring the things flying by and the obstacles that you don't need to worry about, and paying attention to the ones that do voluntarily, which not coincidentally sounds a lot like what that train pain thing was doing. Many of these procedures I found, including some for depression, for example, have a lot to do with the way that we are attentive to certain things in our brain and distracted by other things. And by learning simply through these kind of training mechanisms to be able to focus your attention on one thing and not be distracted by another, it actually can help people in many different ways. So they had 5 clinical trials, over 600 kids with ADHD in 15 states in the US. This has been tested. This slide was from about 3 or 4 years ago. They've done more testing since then. And happily, they've released Endeavor OTC, over the counter, so that you can actually now get this in the App Store and the Play Store, and with a monthly fee, use this game. So if you're interested, it's easy to check it out if you don't like it. And I found, as somebody who, I think I'm on the edges of ADHD, but I'm more neurotypical, I actually found it extremely challenging to play, and you need to be dedicated to get through it. But what they found is that in I believe it's a 5-week treatment where you play a little bit 5 days a week, so kind of things that we do all the time, then it's actually equivalent to having taken a series of the medicines, but you can actually retain the improvement that they show to about 80 or 90% for at least 6 months. They've tested it 6 months out. I think they have figures for a year out, and it drops off very slowly. So one of the concerns was you play this for 5 weeks and maybe a week later you're back to where you were before. But in fact, a lot of these brain changes are very long-term enduring. And other game-related things that have used MRI and EEG to track changes in the brain have shown similar kinds of things, that games can actually change your brain in lasting ways, and in this case, clearly for the better. The company I'm spending the most time with now is a company called Dopavision that I alluded to before. They're a German company headquartered in Berlin, working with some people all around the world. They came to me to help with a game. It's rather interesting, a little complicated to explain this, but their treatment uses a VR headset. And what the treatment involves is that they found that shining a certain frequency of blue light on your blind spot in your eyes, the part of your eye that actually doesn't see anything, releases optical dopamine just around your eyeball. And when used on children from about 6 to 12, that presence of the extra dopamine helps their eyes change shape and focus better, so that they need less of a prescription or no prescription at all for myopia, for nearsightedness. And the potential, and nearsightedness is affecting over 1 billion people worldwide. It's on the rise with children in particular. And interestingly enough, the theory of why that's the case and why this treatment works is because the color of light that they're using is extremely close to the average light in a blue sky. And as kids are spending more and more time indoors and not going outside and playing our games, unfortunately, their eyes are not getting this blue light. In certain indigenous tribes, for example, in the Amazon, where there's a constant jungle overhead, they also tend to be more nearsighted. And you can see this as a sort of Darwinian adaptation, because if you can only see, 50 meters ahead of you maximum, and often a lot less, but you need to see any kind of threats, be it a poisonous spider right next to you or a jaguar creeping through the brush. It's very important. So you can see why, if you're in an environment that doesn't include blue sky and open spaces, it's better for your eye to adjust closer, and vice versa. So that's only a theory, of course, but their initial research has been very promising. So they wear this rather silly-looking but inexpensive headset. It's one of the ones where you slot in a phone, either an iPhone or an Android, and put you into this VR space. But we had to get people to focus on one spot so that the other part of the screen would shine the blue light in the right spot, and they wouldn't actually see it because it would be hitting their blind spot. So we needed to come up with a game that was playable, thankfully, for just a few minutes a day, where they're looking at a tiny dot that's about 3 degrees of their whole field of vision. So very small. In fact, in terms of pixels, it was very similar to the games I was working on, many decades ago, with like 150 to 300 pixels across. So, tiny by today's standards, and only a small part of the phone screen. Anyway, we found that was effective, but they were having problems with adherence to play the game over and over again every day, because, as I say, this is 6 to 12-year-olds. Their attention spans were not great to begin with. So they asked me to write a graphic novel, which is almost finished, and enough. We've got, I think, 9 months of graphic novel out there, released at 1 panel a day. You can see a sample panel here. The text shows up at the bottom because it's localized to many different languages, so we didn't want to do word balloons and take up the real estate. But I've written a story about a group of kids that are just a little older than our target audience, who are enlisted by a doctor who's designed some little nanotechnology robots that go inside the body. And I won't get into the full story, but what was interesting for me about that, as I mentioned earlier on, how there's such a challenge. This company is a great example, making games that play in a 3-degree field of view and are replayable, and also having reasons like this graphic novel to get these kids to come back is really interesting. But in designing the storyline, I talked to them, and one of their biggest concerns are the regulatory boards, and saying, well, this game, is this really going to help kids, or are they just going to play a game and say they feel better? And the thought was, by making it based on real science, because even though it's a fanciful thing with the nanobots, I've been taking great pains to make sure everything they do in the body is actually quite realistic, and having to learn quite a bit about the way the brain and parts of the body work. And it's working very well at getting these kids to be eager to keep playing, to see what happens next the next day. So let's see. In summary, these games are being used for a lot of different purposes. I've just, you scratch the surface here, but you can see, in addition to pain, rehabilitation from stroke, training doctors, other caregivers, meditation and calm, anti-anxiety. Haven't even talked about PTSD, which is a major thing that VR is being used to treat, and nearsightedness, ADHD. It's just amazing, the range. There's more and more. I was approached recently by a company that has an app that analyzes people's coughs to tell whether it's a serious problem or not. And they're having problems getting people to use it regularly, so they're looking to add some gameplay. But I never thought that I'd have to make a game that would help analyze coughing, for example. And it's not just games, but as you can see, some of these don't involve games so much as the tools and technology that we apply. And it's important because many of you, I think, have the kinds of skills, and many of you I know are just in the process of building your careers, deciding what to do. This field of games and health is incredibly reminiscent to me of what the entire games industry was in the 1980s, both in the sense that people are very collaborative and they're sharing solutions because it's so new. There literally is only one company I know of that's trying to cure myopia with video games. But even if there were 10 companies with 1 billion people worldwide needing it, there's plenty of market to go around. But it's also got the room to expand and grow to 100, 1,000 times bigger than it is. And when I was in the 1980s, it never occurred to me that games would become, literally, in fact, closer to 1 million times bigger in terms of reach compared to when I was just starting. And I believe that this has maybe not quite that level of expansion, but close to it. And of course, it also, covers a whole range of very simple games, and people have done some of these things successfully, certainly starting for just as equivalent of an indie game and then building it up to something much bigger, all the way to companies like Akili that raised $130 million and then went public and raised an additional $180 million. They're currently the sort of record holders on this because you need that kind of money to test these sorts of things and create new ones. It's actually small change compared to what the drug companies are using for the kinds of drugs they're using for ADHD. So there's a lot of potential for some companies to be billion-dollar level companies out there. But we're still in these early stages. And with so much room to grow, there are going to be lots of jobs out there. I'm already seeing a lot of demand for my services, and I'm always happy to recommend other designers for the kind of work I do, but also teams that are interested in this. And I have already found there are at least 20 or 30 companies around the world that are either exclusively or largely doing this sort of games and health work. So that has a lot of potential too, a lot of room to grow. And finally, helping people and, potentially curing disease, helping 1 billion people who are nearsighted, helping people who are suffering from cancer stick with their treatment regimens. All those things are extremely satisfying, and it's great to be able to have people who are having a good time and making, fun games, and at the same time having all these other side benefits. So feel free to contact me afterwards, but that's the end of the formal talk, and I've saved 10 minutes or so for some Q&A. Feel free to delve into any aspect of this or other stuff I haven't talked about. Thank you. Yes? Oh, sorry. Are we doing a microphone, or do you want me to? I was going to shout. The redhead here.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful talk and for sharing all of these wonderful companies and projects. I'm curious, would you say that the entry bar is somewhat higher because there's a lot of medical topics, even just for designers or other people in the industry, not necessarily the researchers?
That's a really good question. In fact, you might think that, but my experience has been that for most cases, it's actually a lower bar, because these are people who are starting from things that are not only sometimes not much fun, but actively unfun by being painful or difficult to do. And they're not necessarily looking for, they can't afford to do AAA games, which I find refreshing. They want to do things closer to sort of indie games. I wish I'd been able to show you the snowboarding thing. It was really very simple, but stuff that actually, may even seem 20 years old by games industry standards can be super effective in, to use a game term, in terms of helping people. And so you don't need to necessarily be up on all the very latest technologies. You need to know how to be good at making games, certainly. But what I've found is a lot of the companies that are doing this as studios are doing it as side jobs because they found it to be a very interesting, lucrative area that doesn't really tax them very much, and means that instead of the big boom and bust and layoff cycle, they're able to have a much more steady go at it because they don't have to worry about selling stuff into a end of the year market, that sort of thing. As a designer, I certainly have an interest in this, but I showed you my mother at the beginning, and that part of that was she's long gone, I'm sorry to say, but I take some pride in the fact that I never became a doctor, but I get to work with a lot of them now, so she's probably up there somewhere happy about that at least. But you don't need a lot of experience. Other questions, please?
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Out of curiosity, how do you make a doctor who never played any games prescribe a game to a patient? I mean, when you said that car chasing game featured on the science cover was only available through prescriptions, like how many doctors were aware of it?
Well, the interesting thing is, it's certainly an issue, as it has been my entire time in the games industry, is that people who did not grow up with video games often are resistant to them. But over time, compared to 40 years ago, there are way fewer of those people around now. And even among doctors, I can say with great circumstantial evidence, I would say 90% of doctors who go through med school these days, besides having played games as kids, use them as a way to relax from the stresses of med school. It's amazing how accepting many of them are. And of course, the medical industry as a whole is constantly looking for and incorporating new technologies in what they do. So part of the way that it's possible to reach doctors is by talking about this. Is it's like when MRI machines were a brand new thing, highly technological, difficult to use. And there is still a small stigma about games. But the best thing about it is that every time I see tests being done with quality digital therapeutics, the results actually exceed people's expectations. And when you go and publish in scientific journals and get that kind of rigorous study, it can convince the doctors. That said, you're absolutely right. It can be difficult to convince them, partly because practicing doctors are very busy and they don't want to have to learn about a whole new thing if they can help it. And so Akili, in raising all that money, has been using a lot of it in creating a sales force, going out to doctors. And they pivoted, as I said, just a few months ago, realizing that requiring a prescription really gives you this tight bottleneck. And there's a bunch of other reasons why it slows down sales. So by opening it up to anyone, their hope and their expectations are that it can actually increase the availability and make it a lot easier for people to use. So my sense is Akili's the first, and as I say, the only one to have done this so far. A lot of other people are going for that kind of level of efficacy proof, but my guess is that fewer of them will actually try to be prescription only because of the experience Akili has had, until 10 years from now, it's become a commonplace thing. One of who's got the microphone in the back there, we have a few people. I didn't see who was first. My apologies. I'll try and work my way around.
Hi, Noah. I'm Simon. Thanks for your talk. Very interesting stuff.
Thank you.
So you were saying that games can have a very positive impact on our brain and even change how they work in the weeks or months follow. So I instantly have a question about, the reverse of that. Do you research like the negative impact of games, and what can you tell about that?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. There has been a lot of research, and certainly years ago, there were constant claims that violent games were causing violence in kids, and over again, it was proven that didn't happen, which was great news for the games industry in general. But in this particular case, it makes you think, well, wait a minute, if violent games didn't make people violent, then why are healthy games making people healthy? And it turns out that the reason is you need to do some very specific things, like the Akili game that I talked about, as I said, doesn't feel like a normal game. It is very specifically tailored for what it's trying to do. But there have been other studies showing that games or even game-related behavior can change people's brains in positive ways. A lot of studies of London cab drivers that have a larger part of their brain dedicated to location than most people do, because they do that over and over again. And in a similar way, fundamental processes in the brain, executive function in general, working memory, and attention in particular, are all things that are a lot like muscles that can be exercised over and over again and made stronger. And particularly your ability to choose to focus on something. This is where the meditation stuff also comes in. For thousands of years, people have been learning how to use meditation to control their thoughts, to ignore certain thoughts or feelings, clear their mind, or concentrate on one thing. These are just technological ways that make that a lot easier. But there's been, there's a man named Dr. Richie Davidson who's done a lot of work with monks and meditation and putting them in MRI and EEG that you can look up. So there's a lot of studies showing why it works in certain circumstances and not in others. So it's too complicated to get much deeper into it, but that's overall, why this is helpful for the health stuff. And you certainly do have to be careful that we're not causing any damage, but that's also part of what the regulatory boards are there to do. The next woman here.
Thank you for the talk. And I would like to ask more about the psychological health, because we know that there are a lot of games that cover the topic, but there are games. Like, first and foremost, there are games. And of course, we have players that writing that while playing, for example, even The Last of Us and the Joel sequence, they, had this moment of catharsis according to their own very bad, of course, experiences in life. But I get the feeling that there are still like a lot of psychological issues that are not really covered when it comes to this kind of games, while it could be a great form of therapeutics. And I would like to ask about your opinion. I don't know how much this is the area of your, competence. Why still psychologists and maybe psychiatrists are a bit more aloof when it comes to using this as a part of therapeutic process, at least in Poland. I'm not really sure about the US market.
Well, I think people who have gone through years of training in anything, and then I think the reason why psychotherapists in general, you're absolutely right, there is a fair amount of resistance there, is that compared to some of the more sort of purely medical things there that a doctor can prescribe and use, I think a lot of therapists are threatened that this may replace them, or someone can use an app to treat their depression and not come to the therapist. And I think that's actually true. There will be some adjustment there, but the thing that's good for us in the games industry and for people in the world at large is that we don't need the reluctant ones to buy into this if we can actually have the smaller handful of cooperative ones who can make better apps with us. And one of the big advantages of doing an app to treat any of these things is that it scales, infinitely. If something works really well, 1 billion people can use it. If a doctor, therapist works really well, maybe a few dozen people can see that person and they can train others, but of course it's way faster to do this. So there are many, we can talk separately, feel free to contact me. My wife is actually a retired psychotherapist, so we've had a lot of discussions about this, but depression is actually kind of next on the list for a lot of companies. I'm working with some. There's a company I've worked with that's doing an EMDR treatment for trauma that is not particularly game-like, but is using the game technologies. There have, since year 2000 or the late 1990s, people have effectively been using VR to treat phobias with exposure therapy, and it's only gotten better and better. So the list goes on. And yes, there is reluctance, and I think it's because of their jobs feel threatened, which may be true, but this is also part of what happens in the whole world. And if they learn to use these things in their practice, I don't think that they need to be threatened. Um, uh, I'm going to jump over here. This woman was looking very eager.
Yeah,
So.
I would. Oh, thank you very much. I would actually like to add on that. Don't you think it's rather beneficial, and it can go hand in hand for the psychological treatments? Instead of feeling threatened by it, it can actually enhance the therapy, because the therapist cannot be there 24/7. But the phone, the apps, like patients are getting homework to do to psychotherapy is a double side. It's not only the therapist working on you, but mainly you working on yourself. You have to follow up and
Absolutely
rewire
true.
your brain. And as psychotherapists work, they need, for example, psychiatrists, right? They need the medicine, and that's often going hand in hand with the psychotherapy, together with the medicines, to help rewiring the brains and training, helping the patient to get better. I think I can see extreme potential in games as well, having this extra help to benefit, to actually make the therapy run.
Well, some of the people are
more.
actually designing their games to be used by therapists or in conjunction with them, and just therapists in general. Psychotherapists, there has been some resistance, but others are very encouraged. Occupational and physical therapists are generally really excited about this, because they already have the problem that they bring somebody into their office, they show them the exercises to do, they send them home, they can't do it all in the office, and then they don't do it because it's tiring or boring or painful. That has been an area that has worked really well. As I mentioned, MindMaze, the Swiss company, has done very well with that, and there are at least half a dozen other companies. So we're just about out of time, but I'm going to go out into the hall after this, and happy to continue to answer questions, but I want to leave it for the next speaker so there's room. Thank you, everybody.